Hello, good evening and welcome to the last of today's briefing sessions, and thank you for joining me. Thank you all for joining me. It's particularly a busy one this session, which is impressive given that it's a beautiful evening out there. So thank you for joining me. We'll be about 20 minutes this evening, but if at any point you have any questions that you would like to ask as we go through this session, please do use the chat facility to ask those questions, okay? And Mrs. Body, who's joined me here to my right, will ensure that as much as possible those questions are answered for you. So moving on then, just to give you a brief overview of the session and what to expect, I'm going to give you a very general update on things so that you are aware of where we are and a sense of the timeline and what to expect over coming weeks. I'm going to just make sure that you are clear on some of the key issues that may be affecting your children that are important for us to share with you, and then finally end with some of our most frequently asked questions also. But first things first, and a huge thank you to you really for all of your support, and a huge congratulations and well done to all of your children, our students, for their incredible tenacity, their perseverance, their engagement, their resilience, their patience throughout this entire process. We know it hasn't been easy for them, and we value everything that they have done right from the outset in terms of supporting the process and working with us as part of that process also. So thank you sincerely for that. So general update then, and you'll be familiar with some of these elements already. The roadmap to recovery that Boris Johnson announced in February, followed by the cancellation of the examination, the formal examinations as announced by Gavin Williamson, and then a little bit of detail around the training that we've offered our staff. So we have been really robust and rigorous in the training that we've given our staff, ensuring that they are familiar with the expectations of the JCQ regulations and Ofqual, and also that they have been given the time and opportunity to thoughtfully craft the assessments that have been designed for our students over the course of this year. And they've done a terrific job at that, and we can't underestimate what they've been asked to do. Not only design the assessments, but also then formally mark each of those assessments and turn that marking around as swiftly and fairly as possible, so that we in turn can share those outcomes with our students. So they've done a phenomenal job above and beyond what would normally be expected of them. Also, as part of that training, we've ensured that they are familiar with things such as conscious bias training and subconscious bias training to ensure fairness and parity for all of our students, regardless of backgrounds and ability, and also that our very best markers, those that are most experienced in terms of external examination marking, are part of the core process of assessing at subject level. So we've taken that process really seriously, and we continue to thread through aspects of training at each stage of the process for our staff as well, and again all aimed at ensuring parity and fairness for our children. At the end of last term, we held formal assemblies with Year 11 and Year 13, and they are ongoing. And Mrs. Green has done a terrific job along with Mrs. Lockney of sharing information at each stage of the process to ensure that there are clear channels of communication in place. And I know that both Mrs. Green and Mrs. Lockney have also engaged in significant conversations with our students to ensure that at each stage they are reassured and know what to expect, but equally that they are equipped with the information and resources that they need in order to succeed. Mrs. Body has been regularly sharing information with staff and students, as well as with yourselves, through regular updates and regular letters. And of course, as you know, we're right now in the midst of assessment 2, which will take us across this week and next week for our Year 13s and our Year 11s. Assessment 3 for those students that will be sitting formal assessments as part of their assessment 3 rather than NEAs will take place week beginning Monday the 10th of May. And of course, as always, a reminder that all of the information that I'm sharing with you this evening is accurate and correct as of today, but we will continue to provide updates for you as further information is released by Ofqual and the Department of Education, as well as examination boards. And now I wanted to share with you a particularly useful infographic just to remind you of the timeframes that we're working towards and the key milestones for us as a school and for your children as well. So for us as a school, the key next milestone is on the 18th of June. And on the 18th of June, we have to ensure that all of the grades that we are awarding for all of our students in year 13 and in year 11 are formally submitted to each of the examination boards that we are partnered with, and we are absolutely on track for doing that too through our processes. So we're pleased with how we're working through things. It's keeping us busy and on our toes, but we are pleased with how things are going. And then, of course, the key date for our year 13s is the 10th of August, and it's on the 10th of August that we will be sharing the formally awarded grades with all of our year 13 students. OK, and it is suggested that in terms of appeals for year 11 and year 13, that there will be priority appeals for year 13 so that no students are prevented from moving on to their next phase of learning. Mostly for us, that's going on to university. So we hope to have further clarification soon, and we've had indication that that may come towards the end of April. OK. So some useful reminders about how you can communicate with us and how we're continuously communicating with you also. And the first one is through the dedicated email address that we've set up and established. And thank you to all of you. Actually, you've done a terrific job of making good use of that. And that's helped to inform our webinar today, and also helps us to populate our frequently asked questions as well. So please continue to use that as the formal mechanism for communicating with us, whether you have any questions or indeed whether you have any concerns at each part of the process. Please do use that. Equally, Mrs. Body, who's sitting to my right, is doing an amazing job at ensuring that the website is regularly updated, and we have dedicated pages available on our website, which includes the most up-to-date information that we have, all the letters that have been shared with you, and of course this PowerPoint as well will form part of that web information for you. And then finally, we will continue to share with you the assessment outcomes for all of the assessments that are being compiled. That information will come to our students in the form of percentages, and that's really important. Because we're unable to share any information pertaining to grades specifically with you, but please be mindful of translating those percentages into grades. I know some students have started to do that, and we are actively discouraging them from doing that. They're not formal examinations in the same way, and so those percentages may not necessarily align to the grades in the way that they would if it was a formal examination. So please be mindful of that approach. Moving on to key issues now. And by far the issue that people have asked most questions around comes around the selection of evidence, and I'm wanting to know how we're making decisions about the evidence that we're going to be using, and indeed what evidence we will be using. So I'm sharing with you now a selection of information from JCQ and from Ofqual around that. So the regulations state really clearly that students should only be assessed on the content that has been taught to them. So all of the assessments have been very thoughtfully and carefully designed to ensure that that is the case. OK, but recognising as well that we have a responsibility to ensure breadth and depth of those assessments also. And again, we have absolutely ensured that that is the case, and that's really important, both in terms of ensuring that we produce assessments that are valid, that are robust and meaningful, and really to allow us to formulate grades for each of our students that are equally valid and meaningful and robust, and stand fast against any test in the future. Wherever possible, we'll be using the same assessment evidence base for each student, but we acknowledge and recognise that sometimes that isn't possible. Sometimes students are poorly and are unable to attend assessments, and so we've built in flexibility around that to ensure that no student is adversely affected by any aspect of this process. Alongside that, there is flexibility for our heads of faculty and heads of department to identify the best pieces of evidence that they may have, cohort-wide for our students, to ensure that, again, the evidence that we utilise best reflects the abilities of our students. Now, what we can't do, of course, is do that at an individual level. So we can't pick one set of 5 pieces of evidence for one student and a different set of evidence for another. That just wouldn't be fair. As much as possible, we're looking at the cohort, but we can't do that on a granular individual level. So one of the questions that came through late last week was an important one, and it said, I have read that centres should make students aware of the sources of evidence that will form the basis of the grades that have been submitted. Will this information be shared with students and parents? And the simple answer is yes. We've already shared some information pertaining to that. We know that there are 3 formal assessments that are being undertaken, for example, and that the outcomes of those assessments will be used. But we're also going to use wider evidence, and at the end of this week Mrs. Boddy will be sharing information with you that will outline the sources of information, the evidence that will be used for each one of the subjects, so that there's absolute clarity for our students and for parents about what that will look like. The next important aspect is around appeals. We're pleased that the appeals process is much more thorough this year than it was last year for the centre assessed grades. And there are 3 stages to the appeal process. The first one is called a centre appeal, and in general terms that's an appeal that is made by a student if, for example, the grade that they've been awarded doesn't seem to match the outcomes that they've achieved in their assessments, or the outcomes that they've achieved in the other bits of evidence that they have. And remember, they will know the evidence that's used for each subject, and they will know some of their outcomes in each one of those subjects for the assessments as well. So if there is a disconnect there, then the student can make a stage 1 centre appeal, and that's usually quick to resolve. Sometimes that may happen if there's been a maladministration error, for example. However, it might be that the student is dissatisfied with the grade itself, that they feel that actually they were expecting to get a much higher grade than they've actually been awarded. And at that point, that becomes a candidate appeal. And the school makes a candidate appeal to the examination board on behalf of the student. So it goes through the school, and the school supports the candidate to make that appeal. Now, crucially there, the outcome of that appeal may mean that the awarded grade could go up or down, okay? And the grade that is awarded following on from that appeal, that is the grade that stands. Now, what that means is that a student could receive a higher or lower grade following that appeal, and it's important that students are aware of the risks attached to that. And then finally, the final stage, an unusual one and a rare one, is that the student can make an appeal against the decision made by the examination board. Okay, so they're the 3 core stages of the appeal. The 2 next pieces of information are pertinent. The first relates to access arrangements, and we want to reassure you that access arrangements are in place and have been made for all students that need and require access arrangements, whether that's because of special educational needs and disabilities or because of a medical condition. Okay. For any piece of evidence that is used by individual subjects that has been identified from prior to the date of the 24th of March, it may mean that the school has to apply appropriate retrospective adjustments, and we will do that in line with JCQ regulations. So again, I want to reassure you that if it was that we are now using a piece of evidence as part of this process, that when it was conducted, we weren't expecting to use as part of evidence in the same way, that we will apply those adjustments retrospectively. And then finally, special consideration. So special consideration is consideration that's applied by the school if there has been unusual circumstances that may adversely affect the performance of a student. For example, if there has been a bereavement, or if they have been involved in an accident that has meant that they can no longer write in the same way, if they've broken their wrist, for example, something that would adversely affect their performance. And again, this is likely to be rarer this time, because we know the process, we know our students, and we're much more flexible. But again, if anything has arisen that you need to that we need to be aware of, please make sure that that's communicated to us sooner rather than later. And of course, what are we doing to support our students? Well, as I referenced earlier, really, all staff are doing a fantastic job. Mrs. Lockney is doing a sterling job at ensuring that students are regularly checked on and supporting their well-being, as are various members of the sixth form team. So we're working really, really hard to make sure that that is the case, and that they are supported with their mental health and their well-being, as well as their academic progress. We're keeping them informed as much as possible, whether that's through internal emails, letters, assemblies, or other forms of communication. And alongside that, we're doing our very best to keep you informed at each stage of the process. We're also offering them reassurance, and hopefully that will come through the communication that we're sharing, through the outcomes that we're sharing from the assessment, but also through the conversations that we're having with them. It's really important that they feel an ownership over this process, and that there's clarity attached to that. And as we've said all along, really, we want to ensure that our students, all of them, are in the best possible position to succeed. And so moving swiftly then on to frequently asked questions. And there are four. So the first one is around the historical performance of the grades. And I want to be really clear here. Whereas last year schools were asked to take historical performance of the schools into consideration when formulating and submitting their final grades, we're not being asked to do so in the same way this time round. We are, of course, mindful of the historical performance of the school, but we're not going to use that in any shape or form to penalise our students in any way. Okay. And so I want to be really, really clear. The grades awarded will be based solely on individual performance of the students in the cohort, and not on any historical performance of the school or indeed the faculties themselves. The second question I've already answered. I have read that centres should make students aware of the sources, and yes, we absolutely are going to do that. So please look out for that letter that's going to go out from Mrs. Body later on this week. The next question is around Eid, and yes, of course, we do know that Assessment 3 falls during the Eid celebrations, and we're very mindful of that and supportive of our Muslim community accordingly. A letter will be going out at the end of this week, along with various other pieces of information that explains the arrangements that will be in place to ensure that our students are able to take those assessments, but in a sensible fashion. And finally, when is the last day? The government's confirmed that, as usual, schools are responsible for the education of students until the last day, which is the final Friday in June. Of course, we recognise that many of our students will have completed their assessments ahead of that, and so we're going to take a wise approach to that final day, and we'll be sharing that information with you formally over the course of next week. By the end of next week, you will know when those final days are for our Year 13. I'm just going to look over at Mrs. Body, who's reliably informing me that there are no more questions. So thank you for your time. Thank you for joining me this evening. If you do think of any other questions, please do use that email to engage with us, and we will get back to you as soon as we can. Thank you so much. Have a lovely evening.